New Zealand represents a very unique case study when it comes to the COVID pandemic. And it's larger because it's one of the few places in the world where they were able to largely prevent population exposure to the virus and mass vaccinate their population. So by the time they opened their borders in January of 2022, they had about 91% of their over 12s fully vaccinated. And 95% of, I think, the whole population had at least one vaccine. So this represents a unique view into what are the implications of vaccination and then infection. Now, it must be said that they could only have thought that the vaccine would stop transmission because there would be no other logical reason to vaccinate your whole population. And so, therefore, that piece of information where people want to pretend that they thought otherwise makes no sense in terms of their practical behavior. They went ahead thinking that by vaccinating the whole population or most of it, they would stop the spread of the virus. For those who were looking independently at this, we knew from the start this was going to be a problem because the vaccine wasn't designed to stop transmission, even though it showed some benefit at peak performance, which is within 2 months. It wasn't designed for that purpose. It was there to try and reduce the risk of severe disease. And therefore, anyone who thought that, therefore, by vaccinating everybody, you would stop the circulation of the virus, again, that's completely unscientific and certainly wasn't based on the evidence. Now, something had drawn my attention, which I'll be going through just now, which is this article from Slay News, where it says New Zealand hits the panic button as adverse events skyrocket amongst the mRNA vaxxed. Most of the vaccines used in New Zealand were mRNA, and what he's making reference to, which I will show you shortly, is a thesis paper that was published recently looking at adverse events around the mRNA or COVID vaccines. I'll show you what that's around, but there is a far more serious issue that we have to look at. What really is the situation with regards to mortality across the population? And it's an important question because in it is the question or the answer as to how effective were the vaccines at all cause mortality, not just severe COVID 19, but did they actually reduce the risk of people dying or increase the risk? These are all very, very important questions for which, sadly, we may not have all the answers. Just to make sure, before I get into this, for those people who are interested, coming up shortly is that look at measles and the interaction with COVID. All I can tell you is that as I have been putting this presentation together, it is definitely one of the most serious risks that I have seen when I look at the pandemic, certainly in the USA, where measles is circulating avidly. So let's get back to the article. Here we have Slay News talking about mRNA vaccines adverse events. And what they're talking about here is New Zealand facing a stomach churning reality of a public health crisis after the government's mass vaccination campaign. Clearly, you can see that they're not too happy with the mass vaccination campaign. And as they say, it's one of the most COVID vaccinated countries in the world, administering 260.78 vaccines per 100 people. So that's therefore 2.6 doses per person. Quite remarkable. Now they're facing the grim reality of plummeting public health in the wake of it. Now, I'm not sure if this is accurate because as I have been searching for answers there, I can't necessarily find a lot of it. And in fact, when I looked at the mortality web tool, which is from the Health New Zealand, and this is it here, when they looked at when I looked at it, when they looked at the data, this data set is only up to 1996 to 2022. I don't know what happened to 2023 and 2024. This is very important data, but for some reason, what is available is only up to 2022. They must have good reason for that. So I'm not sure about where they're getting mortality statistics. However, when I did look across the news, it's clear that even towards the end of the summer period in the southern hemisphere, New Zealand is still under a lot of pressure with its hospitals. That's not a good sign going into the winter. And so these are all very, very important trends that have to be addressed. Now, when it comes to this thesis that was produced, here is what it is, and just so you get the context. It's a doctoral thesis looking at adverse events following immunization, comparing the seasonal influenza vaccine and the Pfizer mRNA COVID vaccine in New Zealand. And this was published on the 18th of March, 2025. So it's recently published. And what I wanted to show you here is the only thing available is the abstract, for which we will look at quickly. And you must notice here as well that it is embargoed, meaning that you can't get the full access to the paper until 2026. Now, this may be something due to the university as opposed to anything else, but it's an important document that I would hope that they would make public so that we can look at it in far more detail, because it shows us some very, very stunning information. Here is what the Slay article was talking about. When they looked at adverse events after the vaccination, they looked at what happened with influenza vaccines, looking back to 2010 and over the COVID period to get a baseline as to what they thought was standard for a vaccine. And even the influenza vaccines, I think, have higher adverse effects even than many of the other standard vaccines. And when they looked at it here, so over the 10-year period that they looked at, they had 2,788 reports with regards to adverse events. And they would then find that in most of the reports, 76% were non-serious. And they were able to break it down by the age group and so on. So that's an important thing to break down. And let's go in a little bit more detail when they look at the different year periods here. And this is important for you to get context as to what it is that they're looking at as a baseline. So here we go. This is in 2018. They found it was 41 adverse events per 100,000 doses. And they were comparing the Europeans to the Maori. So it's 41 and 43, not a lot of difference. In 2019, it was 33 per 100,000 doses and 34. That's pretty standard as well. So a little lower in 2019. In 2020, it was 26 doses and 24, so a little bit lower. So you can see this as the trend with regards to influenza vaccines. And as I said, even influenza vaccines still have an impact compared to some of the other vaccines. Here is the bit that caused the article to jump out. And truthfully, this is an important point because when you actually look at these numbers, it makes you take a deep breath. And so here are the numbers when they compared that. Remember, we're talking about 40, 33, and 24. So when they looked at the adverse events from 20th of February 2021 to the 30th of December 2022, so not even quite a full year, during that time, there were 64,956 reports made compared to 2,700 in terms of influenza. So somebody would say, well, that's because they gave far more COVID vaccines than they did influenza. And they're right. Yes, they did. But how did it compare per dose? That's the bit that can't be denied. When you look at it here, it represents a rate of 543 per 100,000 doses administered. Remember, I'm comparing it to right here. We're talking about 26 per 100,000 doses, and in this, they're talking about 543 per 100,000 doses. This is so eye-wateringly big that I didn't even calculate the difference in terms of the average between these compared to what this was. The highest number of reports was recorded in 1 month, September 2021, and that was aligning with the highest dose administration period. Primarily, it showed a higher proportion of reports in young adults, 30 to 39 years old, and females. Now, what can I say? The thing that people don't know is that very often, certainly with the mRNA vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine specifically, when they looked at what happened in Israel, they found the unusual hypermetabolic lymphadenopathy that was affecting a significant proportion of people who were vaccinated. They didn't have a clear mechanism for it, but even after 25 days, people still, I think it was up to 3%, still had enlarged or hypermetabolic lymph nodes noted on PET scans. Additionally, even when they looked at PET scans with the heart, up to 6 months, there were changes in the heart in those who were vaccinated. These are quite complex things, and this is the bit that causes me to be concerned. When I look at what is happening with New Zealand, I then look at what's happening with their current cases. And the reason I'm looking at that is because I'm trying to understand what are the implications for a highly vaccinated population who still have ongoing circulation of the virus. And that's really the question here that I'm trying to understand. What does it mean? So this here information was last updated on the 24th of March, 2025. So this is just a few days ago. And at that time, new cases were 60. Cases in hospital as of midnight were 66, but no deaths attributed to COVID-19. Now, you may think that this is great, but you have to understand what's happening with the virus at the moment. The Denmark paper demonstrated a really concerning trend that if someone was admitted to hospital and had a diagnosis of COVID within 14 days of the admission, they had a 12% mortality risk in 30 days. But they didn't die of COVID. They died of multiple other things. And so if you were not looking at the mortality carefully, you would not have the associated link in terms of COVID. That's the bit that they're missing. So they are attributing immediate deaths around respiratory compromise in COVID as being a COVID death. All I can tell you is that that science is so far off where we are now that we are in trouble. If this is how the scientific community is looking at what is happening now, this is going to hit us like, well, probably not a tsunami. I call it a storm surge. They will just find that this year deaths are higher. Next year it's higher than that. The year after it's higher than that. And it will not keep on, it will keep on rising until we figure out what exactly is going on. And for me, it's all around autoimmunity, spike protein autoimmunity. And this is where the risk is. Just as a final point, when people talk about the effectiveness of the vaccine, remember, as I said, it was created to prevent or reduce the risk of severe COVID-19. It wasn't really focused primarily on transmission. Transmission was an additional feature that was noted that it seemed at peak efficacy to reduce transmission. So here's the question. In anyone puts this in front of you about the effectiveness, just ask the question. In a country that had 91% of the population vaccinated against COVID, what happens when they face the virus? Here is the reality. This is what happened. I'm sorry to say, In my mind, this does not stand out as very effective. It may have reduced severe COVID in some people who are high risk, but certainly not transmission. And even now, the transmission is ongoing, but because it's subclinical, it's quite likely that the amount of transmission is far higher than they actually know at the moment. This is the reality of what we're facing. My call to New Zealand is you have a responsibility to give us valuable data about one, your mortality, and two, what is it that people are dying of, and can you please do autopsies on them? We've recently seen the issue about multiple cardiac microscars in the heart of the boosted people. We want to find correlations. That would be a perfect population to be doing autopsies on, looking in the hearts of those people in New Zealand. Is it primarily vaccine related? Is it primarily infection related? Is it a combination of the two? Autopsy, autopsy, autopsy. Without that, New Zealand, we are flying blind. Only you can give us these answers to help us to be able to get beyond this stage that we're at. Because if we keep on going and hoping for something different, I can warn you that the outcomes are likely to be catastrophic. Let's hope that people will start doing the necessary work in the weeks and months to come. Have a great evening.